Amazing. Okay. Hello, everyone. So nice to see some familiar faces, some new faces, some familiar names, some not familiar names. Um, Thank you to all of you who came from the last year that we had, and it didn't scare you off. And for those of you who are trying out for the first time, you came for a good one. I'm excited for what we're going to be doing today. So for those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Sofia. I'm the Maharat intern at ASBI this year. And a project that I am embarking on with hopefully all of you is a Parsha class. But this Parsha class is a little bit different than other Parsha classes because we're combining both the Torah Shebichtav, the written Torah, with the oral Torah, the Torah Sheba'al Peh. And what that means is that we're using stories and halachic conversations from the Talmud as a kind of commentary for better understanding our Torah portion. So that's what we're going to be doing today. I have a source sheet for us again that I'm going to be posting as a Google Doc that you can all see in the chat. In addition, I'm also going to share my screen so that for those of you that's a little bit more complicated, we'll be able to navigate together. So I'm just going to set that up now. Let's see if it works. Perfect. Okay, great. Amazing. We have one anonymous animal already there. Fantastic. So there's lots of things that we could talk about with Parsha Noach. We could obviously talk about Noah, the story of Noah and the ark. That would probably be the most obvious. But there's really a lot going on in this Parsha, and there's a lot to choose from. And I decided not to focus on that story, even though there's lots to say, and there are lots of Talmudic sources about it as well. I want to talk about the story of the Tower of Babel, Migdal Bavel, and I'm hoping that we'll see some Talmudic sources today that talk about this story in a whole new light and make us think more about what exactly was going on and what exactly was so bad about the tower that was built. So that's what I'm hoping to do today. I'll make this a little bit bigger in advance for us using the screen. Okay. So in order to start, I feel like it makes sense for us to actually quickly go through the story. We need a little bit of a refresher. I know that I read it again after probably many times since day school, and I noticed new things even this time. So it really is new and exciting and fresh, no matter what stage in life you're at. Okay, so first we're going to do the story. I'm going to go through it quickly. Okay, I'm going to read the Hebrew and then explain in English, starting with verse 1 or Pasuk Aleph. So this is already after the story of the flood and Noach. This is now the new generation that is populating the earth. And there was a whole list of generations, the previous chapter. And now we're saying that the whole land was filled with one language and with words that were the same. There's lots of discussion about what exactly that means. Did it mean that they all said the same thing, or there was like a kind of group think going on? So yeah, that should be interesting for us to be thinking about. The next pasuk. So in their traveling from the east, they found a valley in the land of Shinar, and they settled there. Next pasuk. Vayomru ish el re'ehu hava nilbena levenim v'nisrefa lisrefa v'tihi lahem levena la'aven v'hachemar haya lahem lechomer. So now everyone says to their fellow person, let's make some bricks and burn them, like to make them hard, like in a kiln. And they will be great resources for brick and mortar, and we'll have them for building materials. Okay, next pasuk. Vayomru hava nivne lanu ir umigdal v'rosho b'shamayim v'naseh lanu shem pen nafutz al panei kol haaretz. And then they said, let's make for us a city and a tower, and the tower's head is going to go all the way to the sky. And we will create for ourselves a name so that we should not be scattered throughout the whole land. Okay, it seems like God is not going to like that. The next pasuk says, "Vayered Adonai lirot et ha'ir ve'et hamigdal asher banu b'nei ha'adam." And God saw and went down to the city and the tower that was built by people. Vayomer Adonai, hein am echad v'safa achat l'chulam. So God is noticing what's going on and says, if as one people with one language for all, this is how they've begun to act, then nothing that they may propose will be out of their reach. Hava nirdav navla sham sfatam asher lo yishnu ish sifat re'ehu. Let's go down in the plural also, just like last week that we had God speaking in the plural. And let us go confuse their languages so that they won't be able to listen to the languages of one another. Vayafetz Adonai otam misham al pnei kol haaretz vayachtalu livnot ha'ir. And so God scattered them from across the land, and the city stopped being built. Alkein karashema Bavel, kisham balal Adonai sifat kol haaretz umisham hafitzam Adonai al pnei kol haaretz. And so that is why it was called Babel, or Babylon, because that is where the verb in Hebrew for confusing, balal, sounds similar to Babel. That is where God confused everyone's languages so that they wouldn't be able to understand each other. And then God scattered everyone. So that is our story of Migdal Bavel. And right after that, more generations are listed all the way to Abraham. And then that's where we're going to pick up next week's Parsha with Lech Lecha. So I'm curious what people think, and feel free to participate just like we had last time. What do you think is actually going wrong here? What does God see that God finds so problematic that God feels that God needs to intervene? Does anyone have any thoughts?
Go with Ruth.
Ruth, were you raising your hand? I missed that.
I thought you were. Dr. Ruth, were you raising your hand?
I was.
Oh, yes, please go for it.
So one thing that strikes me is that last week, man was created in God's image, right? And here you have man doing something, and God is saying, oh no, if they can do this, they can do, they can do anything. So it's like he needs to thwart their efforts.
Right. And what's wrong with people doing anything?
It sort of feels like God is being threatened. That this sense of working cooperatively empowers them to a point where God is shaken, it's sort of interesting because it's the hefik. It's the opposite of what one would assume, that it would be good for people to work together and to try and achieve things jointly. It almost reminds me of eating of the tree, and this that people are getting empowered in a way that was not part of God's plan, perhaps.
Right. Like, is it that the act itself was maybe a problem, or is that God wasn't expecting it? Pursuing knowledge, going back to last week, that doesn't seem so bad, but it doesn't seem to be what God anticipated. Yeah, thank you. Any other thoughts that people want to share? Yeah, Barry.
I think Ruth and Linda are spot on in a lot of what they say. And it's great to see you guys. I've known them for years, Sofia, and it's always great to learn with them. I am bothered with what seems to be God being bothered. What I see is, I think the plus on God's side is the Rashi commentary that I read, that God comes down to see what's going on. And Rashi comments, to my delight, that God is showing an example to his heavenly court and his earthly court to come, that you don't just look, you go and see and check it out and investigate and get witnesses and whatnot. God doesn't have to do all of that, but God doesn't have to do any of that. But God does by example, just as he did by example when he created Adam and asked the angels, let's get together and create this guy. The angels had differences of opinion. What bothers me is later on, we see the concept of Yeshurun and the comment that God delights when the heads of Israel are together and working together and pulling together, some unanimity, at least some brotherhood that pervades the whole people and their elders. And that's great then. What bothers me is what's missing from that now. God can control this. God doesn't have to be afraid of anything. So I think we're on the wrong track if we're wondering what's bothering God, other than maybe mankind moving ahead too fast of a pace or getting ahead of us, getting ahead of ourselves. That's what I'm thinking. I'm kind of perplexed.
Yes, I think this is actually touching, I think, on a lot of what has been said so far, is that what they seem to be doing, if it really is just that they're all working together on this great project, it does seem theologically problematic to think that God wouldn't want that. And in fact, there's other texts, like you were saying about Yeshurun, that say that, no, God is very happy when we're able to all work together and create projects. So what I'd like to suggest is that's exactly what Chazal, the rabbis of the Talmud, are also troubled by, and we need to figure out something else that must be happening at that Tower of Babel that makes it so bad that God needs to get involved. And I'm hoping that by reading the Talmudic sources today, I'm thinking about, well, what exactly was going on over there that was so bad, that we can have a whole new perspective about what's going on. And I like the answers. Some of the answers are quite funny, so I'm excited to look at them all with you. Okay, so now we're on the Gemara sources, and we're starting at Masechet Sanhedrin. In the discussion in the last chapter, Sanhedrin is all the different types of people who will not get a portion in the world to come. It's a very crazy end chapter. You learn a lot about what constitutes heresy, what doesn't constitute heresy, what kings were good and which kings were bad, that they didn't get to come to the world to come. But another detail is mentioned, which is that the Dor HaHaflaga, the generation of the dispersion, which is the generation that builds the Tower of Babel, doesn't get to have a portion in the world to come. And so the question is, that's originally in the Mishnah there, and the Gemara is going to try and figure out why that's the case. And that's going to hopefully give us a little bit of a window into what exactly went on at the Tower of Babel. So I'm going to read this in the English for the sake of simplicity. And it says, the Mishnah teaches that the members of the generation of the dispersion have no share in the world to come. The Gemara asks, what sin did they perform? The Gemara is concerned with exactly what we were saying. What exactly were they doing that was so bad, so much so that they're not going to be able to be in the world to come when they pass away? Their sin is not explicitly delineated in the Torah, right? It doesn't say in the text, okay, this is exactly what went wrong. The school of Rabbi Shela says that the builders of the Tower of Babel said, we will build the tower and ascend to heaven, and we will strike it with axes so that its water will flow.
Oh, wow.
They laughed at this explanation in the West, Eretz Yisrael, and asked, if that was their objective, let them build a tower on a mountain. Why did they specifically build it in a valley? So this is a quite weird answer, right? They're saying like, oh, it's this technical point that it almost had to do with like trying to make sure that they got rain. I personally, unless people see otherwise, don't see what is so heretical about that. And I think that the Gemara is reflecting that because, and this is a great example of when, how that oral tradition is really in dialogue with so many different groups of Jews all over the world. The Jews that were still in Eretz Yisrael, not in Babylon yet, heard this and they laughed at it. They went, that's silly. You Babylonian Talmudic Jews, you didn't really understand like how agriculture works and how the water works. You think that it would be better for them to have the tower function as some kind of water source for their plants. But if they were to do that, they built it explicitly in a valley. That's what it says in the text that we had, the actual Tanakh source. So if that was really what it was all about, it should be built on a mountain. So that seems like a pedantic point to me, but I think that it's interesting that they start off this way. I personally would love if people think that they have a reason for maybe why they're talking about the water. I'm all ears because I don't see a reason why, but this is how our text begins.
Well, one wonders what.
I think a simple explanation is, so if you're in the valley, then to get up to the heavens, you have to build it that much higher, right? But if you start at a higher point, then you get there quicker.
Right, and they didn't do it that way.
Right. But why? I guess so. They were. I mean, again, they're trying to be godlike. Well, we'll control the heavens so that we can control the water, right? So we can have rain whenever we want it, and not have to pray to God, not have to rely on God. We'll do it ourselves.
Right. Maybe there's something fishy going on, right? By them saying like, oh, it's about getting the water. But if they really wanted to just get water, it seems like a very naive approach. And why did they build it in a valley? So maybe that's what they're trying to go at.
Ruth Slather comment is what strikes me as really getting down to it in this point. First of all, I see Rabbi Shela not having a source at this point. Maybe that's just because it's an excerpt from Sanhedrin and not the rest of the text. Maybe somewhere else there is water, or maybe somewhere else he has a source. But just to say this out of the clear is just like me reading a Rashi commentary and extolling it, but not having a farther background to it. So Rav Shela, who I wouldn't attempt to dispute, I have to scratch my head and wonder, where is he saying this from? How has he studied this? It never occurred to me. I don't see it in the text or any hint of it in the commentary of Rashi. That being said, even so, taking it at face value, you have to impute that mindset that Ruth and you are saying, because otherwise, how do you go back to the first sentence and say this generation has no share in the world to come, which has to, in my mind, deduce, compel me to deduce that there is an evil here. Making a mistake, being able to do tshuva, doesn't exempt you from the world to come, or keep you out of it. You get to do tshuva. God is patient to let us do tshuva. So where is this statement coming from as the first statement in this section of the Talmud? It's got to be evil. Something about this has to be evil, and we haven't seen it yet. Maybe we should go on.
Maybe it's something that man has in his mind the ability to control and to access directly. So in this case, they're talking about water, but the idea that God is not in the picture at all, that man is sort of exerting himself to achieve what he wants without understanding that there's another power in the world, that he doesn't have this control.
Oh, that's great.
That's one good line of reasoning. You can deduce that from the text and from this excerpt, but as a mind reading function, we don't see any evidence of what was in their mindset. And later on, when we argue, this is pre-Torah, of course, and when we get Torah, we're told, imitate God, be kosher. You're holy because God creates us to be holy. And Rav Soloveitchik later on says in the 20th century that we should cleave to God, and to each other and to other righteous people. It's in and it's not out, and it's hard to say what's going on here. Really, I'm still uneasy about what's going on. What's the evil? What's going on here? It must be something that we're not seeing in terms of source. We have to guess it. We have to wonder it.
Audrey also brings up a good point in the chat that maybe, and this I think is similar to Linda's point of that asking for rain and trying to be resourceful with your crops is not necessarily the issue, but it seems to be the lack of acknowledgement that it comes from God, and assuming that it's like merely a pipeline, right, like from the clouds to the ground, and that there isn't some kind of role of approaching God and recognizing where it's coming from that's necessary. But I also agree that, like, as much as that's like a nice message about the need to acknowledge God in our lives, like that it's still, we're not going to the world to come. So there must be something even sharper going on. So I'm going to push us to the next part of the text because there's going to be even more. Okay, so this is a continuation of the text in Sanhedrin, and there's more clarification, this time from Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Elazar, and I'll continue in the English. So it says, rather, Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Elazar says, they divided into three factions. So the dispersed people split into three. One said, let us ascend to the top of the tower and dwell there. And one said, let us ascend to the top of the tower and engage in idol worship. And one said, let us ascend to the top of the tower and wage war. With regard to that faction, as in the first one, that said, let us ascend to the top of the tower and dwell there, the punishment was that God dispersed them, right? That they're supposed to live on the top, and now the punishment is that they should be spread out. And that faction that said, let us ascend to the top of the tower and wage war, they became apes and spirits and demons and female demons, which I think is fun. And with regard to that faction, the last one that said, let us ascend to the top of the tower and engage in idol worship, it is written, because there the Lord confounded the language of all the earth. So it seems that that there's a recognition, especially in the Psukim themselves, that there's a lot going on, that there's a lot of different statements, right? Like, remember, originally it said, oh, like, let's build bricks, let's build a tower. Like, there's multiple statements. And then there's also multiple different punishments, right? Dispersion, confusion of language. And I think what the rabbis see here is an opportunity for Midrash to say, well, there must be a reason why there's so many different statements. So we need to think about that. It must have been different issues coming up. And so now God needs to punish them each for their respective differences. And so it seems here that it's not just, oh, we don't understand how to put God a part of our lives, but that there's real engagement in idol worship, there's engagement in war. Those things I think are a little bit more like we can easily put in the evil category as opposed to just human beings not recognizing the God in their lives. I also think it's hilarious that like the one that isn't in the pasuk, right? The one that they go to war, that energy of, I guess, wanting to wage war, it didn't disappear. But now every single time you see apes, it literally says kofim, like a kof is a monkey in modern Hebrew. That and demons, all these things that the rabbis of the Talmud did believe in, which I think is like a little bit funny for us in our 21st century thinking.
I don't know.
All of that energy still exists in the world today in like a little bit of a chaotic sense. So this feels to me like a little bit more of a concrete reason for why they shouldn't be going into the world to come. Does anyone have any thoughts about that, especially in comparison to what we just read? Is that feeling better than what we saw before? Is it still frustrating?
I don't think it's better. I think it's someone's imagination. I mean, I don't think anything in the text tells you this.
You
So
don't have broader topic. Yeah,
so I
you don't
think-
have broader topic. I'm sorry. Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry.
No, I'm sorry. I
What?
say go ahead and speak. I have something to say when you're done.
Oh, okay. So I don't have very much more to say, except that it feels to me that it's an attempt to try and understand what your question is, and give some meaning to it. But they could have said something other altogether. I don't know where this is coming from in terms of the text.
Yeah. Barry, did you want to say something to
I
that?
did.
Or?
I'm thinking. I'm going back to a source now. I'm thinking, for one thing, that like I spoke my mind about Rob Shayla not having any particular source or origin of where he's drawing this information from, another rabbi who taught him, or something in a midrash or a Braita or Mishnah or something. I'm not seeing any source stuff here, unless it's elsewhere. But not seeing that source stuff lends to a lot of what Linda just said, which I would share in that because of that. And that is, these are things that these guys are saying that they believe or think or have to share from their own intellects, and yet they're not sharing where that comes from, what the source is, which I think which I think separates great teachers from good teachers. So knowing as best as we can where they come from, and I don't see any of this. Well, yeah, I'm wondering, and I'm still back at the evil. Until we saw idol worship, I didn't see the evil. The
Right.
first time I see something evil is when I see idol worship, and maybe war. Worshiping at the top is maybe a little too premature, and a little haughty on the part of man, and also the general concept that we're not seeing. There's already a tradition. God spoke to Adam and Chava. God spoke to Noach. I don't know if he spoke to the family, but he certainly spoke to Noach. And yet we're not seeing that these people have any inkling of that. So whoever said before, hats off to you. I'm not seeing, nobody's saying anything about God here.
Mhm.
That, we came to this point, we survived, and we are the generation after the flood because God wanted us to come next. God controls the neshamot that he sends down to earth. We're next. Now it's time for us to do something good. And now let's try to do this. I'm not seeing any of that background to it.
Well,
Yeah.
I think I think that both Linda and Barry, you're lucky because the Gemara is about to bring yet another understanding and also
Okay.
provide a little bit more of a textual background, which I think, like what Linda was mentioning, like where are they getting this from?
Yeah.
And you might be frustrated with how they do it because it's going to be with some Gemara, exegetical methods, which aren't necessarily the most thought through, or like not,
Okay.
sorry, they're definitely thought through, but they might not be the most obvious to us. But I think that
Okay.
the Gemara is recognizing this issue. So now we'll go to the last part of Sanhedrin. And I highlighted for us in the color purple so we can understand this exegetical method. Okay, the next part. It is taught in a Braita. Rabbi Nachman says, all of those factions intended to build the tower for the sake of idol worship. So let's get rid of like these three different things. That's too confusing. And you're right, like some of them don't seem to be so bad. Actually, all of them were concerned about idol worship. But how do we know that?
Wow.
It is written here, as it says in our verse, and let us make a name for us. I don't know if you remember when we read it originally, there was a weird line where it said, let's build a tower and let's build for us a name, which is a little bit strange. I mean, the way that maybe we might think about it in a nice positive way is the name Yad Vashem, right? Which is the name of the Holocaust Memorial Center in Jerusalem,
Yes, yes.
comes from a Haftorah in Yeshayahu, where we talk about like having a memorial that is both a tower, a monument, and for names. It's like there is a connection there, like that's sometimes used, but overall, that this is what they wanted to do. The Dora Haflagah, the generation of dispersion, wanted to build a name. They're picking up on that because that seems kind of either superfluous or we don't really understand what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And it is written here. They find another pasuk that also uses the term shame and make no mention of the name of other gods. So taken from Parshat Mishpatim all the way in Sefer Shemot, where we're listing a lot of different rules, the Torah is being given in that moment already. It says that we should not be bowing down or even talking about other gods, and they use the term shame. So it says, Malhalan avodat kochavim, avkan avodat kochavim. There, in the pasuk in Exodus, it says sham, and it means, it says shame, and it means the name of other gods. Therefore, when we're saying shame, shame, it must also be talking about other gods.
Right.
So that's how they solve that problem. They say, oh no, it's like basically in the pshat, it's in the literal understanding of the story that they must be talking about other gods. So I think they've technically solved Linda's problem, being like, okay, here's a source.
Maybe mine.
But it's a little bit of a stretch, I would say. But I think that the conclusion of this source being that they were coming up with all these ideas. Was it about the water? Was it about war? Was it about being on the top of the tower? That wasn't good enough for all the issues we brought up. That doesn't feel like a strong enough reason to not go to the world to come. And also, where did they get that from? That's really not there. This is their attempt at like making the best stretch possible to say that no, it's pretty explicit in the text that it must be about worshiping other gods. Yeah, very.
I'm taking what you're saying now and linking, if you're linking the word shame to other gods, first of all, it sure shows that dispersing and creating different languages for that generation certainly didn't chill the effect of idol worship. It's been going on since then to this very moment, I'm sure. So that's a problem to me. How does that solve God's problem? Is if that's what God is saying is let's disperse these guys. It's a punishment, but it's not a cure or a resolution. The other thing is, until you say that, to make a name, and if it's an open one, that's exactly, now the circumstances are different, and I'll admit that, and I'll accept that as a differentiation, because I see differentiations, and throughout my schooling, I've learned how to see my way of differentiating. I see differentiation, but I still see a partial similarity about what God did with us coming out of Egypt. He brought us out as a nation. He made, well, the generic he ladies, I'm sorry, God made a name for us, bringing us out. And he put fear into other nations about us going in until Amalek jumped into the hot water and cooled it off and started exposing us. But until then, God was making our name, and that wasn't the wrong thing. So you got to link that concept of making a name to something else. And it seems to me to be idol worship, and I guess that's what's going on here. I'm still a little weak on the sourcing as well, but Linda has spoken well. You've spoken well. Dr. Ruth's spoken well. There's a lot going on here.
Yeah, there's an amazing shiur by Rabbi Menachem Liebtag, if people are familiar with the name. If not, he has a website called tanakh.org, where he talks about, he actually thinks like part of the Jewish calling is about creating a name for ourselves. And he looks at the term shame that appears throughout Tanakh. And it's very well done. I don't think he talks about this, but he also talks about how it's clear that for the Jewish God, that God's name is ineffable. That's like also something that's like very integral, is that saying, oh, let's make for us a name, something like that makes something deeply tangible. And there's something about the mystique of the God of Judaism's name not being able to be pronounced, that like that shows that it's above the usual way we talk about names. So I don't know if it's like exactly connected, but I think that there might be something there, like the assumption that we should just be able to make names, and that doesn't require lots of time, effort, connection with God. That might be something that's a little more superfluous. So if you ever want to go down a fun rabbit hole there, I'm happy to send it to people after the shiur.
One more quick comment.
Yeah, sure.
If I'm reminded of the liturgy we have and holy writings, where when we talk about, I was just mentioning how I thought of God making our name for us and giving us a prominence and a fear and prominence in Moshe and Har Sinai, that God would dwell amongst us to the exclusion of all the other nations, and therefore giving us a prominence and making a name for us. And yet in our liturgy, to our credit, thank God, that we are and we're smart enough to realize what we say about, and we are called by your name when we speak to God, when we pray, and when we recognize in study, when we recognize a name. One of the things we say is we are called by your name, especially in Tachanim, right? And other things like that. When we're pleading for forgiveness, when we're pleading for mercy, one of the things we say is we have no merit, but we are called by your name. And so we are linking our name to God, and that's to our credit, and that's what we're trying to exploit at that point. And maybe that's what makes us different.
Right. Well, I think that's about that God's name and our name being connected is possible, but that's after we've been in relationship and covenant with God, and then here are these people just building this tower. Right? So maybe it's the misuse of that. So yeah. So I want to continue a little bit farther. I want to show, this wasn't even the Gemara source I wanted to show you. This was just the preface, to show you where the idea that idol worship may have been connected. I want to bring a new character into the story, which is the character of Nimrod. People might be familiar with like the English term Nimrod. I don't know if people say that anymore. It's like not really a nice thing to say to people. Like, oh, you're so thick. Not, I don't know, like you're kind of big and lanky. Like you don't really know how to see yourself in relationship to others, like with space. And the Gemara seems to suggest that Nimrod is an integral character behind this story, and that's going to lead to a whole new route of seeing this idol worship story. So to give us some context, we have from Masechet Chulin. This is in a larger discussion about how when Jewish, this is in the context of the Tanakh, when the Jews talk about praising God, they're very cognizant of saying that I am yet dust and ashes, I am merely a worm. But then all the non-Jewish rulers, when they talk about God, they become more powerful. So it's in a list of Nimrod, Pharaoh, Nebuchadnezzar, and this is the line about Nimrod, and it clearly suggests that greatness was given to Nimrod, and then it says that he said, come, let us build a city. So here, the Gemara seems to be seeing that line that we saw originally in the Tanakh as Nimrod saying it, not just the group of people, but Nimrod himself was saying it. And the question is why? We have to figure that out. If we go to back to Genesis chapter 10, verses 8 and 9, this is actually where we get the name Nimrod. Like it's not just he's a character in the Gemara. It's true that as a character becomes fleshed out in the Gemara, but he does exist in the Tanakh. When they're listing all these generations of who was born, Nimrod is mentioned, and it says explicitly that he was the first mighty figure on earth. So that's probably where the correlation of Nimrod and strength comes from. He was a mighty hunter by the grace of God, hence the saying, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter by the grace of God. Okay, that's a fun phrase. So that was goodness that was given to Nimrod. And so it seems that the Gemara is saying, oh, but he didn't appreciate what God had given him, and then he builds this city. So why would the city in Migdal Babel be an issue? This line himself clearly says, the disciple in the corruption of Nimrod the wicked, who caused the entire world to rebel against me during his reign. So clearly here, there seems to be a rabbinic understanding that building the tower was definitely was a way to rebel God, and Nimrod was the head of it. So before we unpack all of that, now I want to go to the last Gemara source, that this is all the background information. And with all of it now, we might have a completely new understanding of what was happening at Migdal Babel and how is Nimrod involved. And maybe this will make us have a whole new sympathy of what was going on. What kind of idol worship was happening? And this is in Masechet Avodah Zarah. Makes sense because Avodah Zarah is about idol worship. Okay. The Gemara says, Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba says that Rav says, the temple of Nimrod, i.e., this is helpful that we have Steinsaltz here, but I have the Rashi that explains it too. The remnants of the Tower of Babel is considered a place of idol worship, whose worshippers abandoned it in peacetime and is therefore permitted. So this is in discussion of a larger point, which is in Avodah Zarah. We talk about how idols you halachically have to destroy, but also you won't be able to get any benefit from them. So people joke, there's like halachic discussions about this today. Like if you wanted, let's say in the Met, since I live in New York, if you wanted to go to the Met, there's an amazing Egyptian temple there called the Temple of Dender, and people have weddings there. So there's a real halachic question of, can you benefit from that as a wedding venue? That used to be a clear place of idol worship. And you're not supposed to get any benefit halachically from a place of worship or idol worship. We're supposed to distance ourselves from it. So it becomes this halachic question of, well, how do you determine what counts as idol worship or not? And also, if it's not currently in usage anymore, and people have distanced themselves from it, maybe it's okay. So they're discussing all these things, not the Temple of Dender, because this is the Talmud, but these kinds of things. What kind of benefit can you get from things that used to be worshipped as idols, and when they've been distant and people don't worship them anymore? So that is the context in which the Gemara is coming. They're saying the temple of Nimrod, which Rashi and the Steinsaltz explain, is not just a temple, but is the actual tower itself. Migdal Bavel was a kind of temple that Nimrod used to worship things. That is considered a place of idol worship. However, it's been abandoned, and therefore it is okay now to, I guess, like walk by it, benefit from it. If you want to the wedding venue in the Tower of Babel, you could. Okay, let's read further before we unpack more of this. This is despite the fact that when the merciful ones scattered the builders of the tower, the situation resembled wartime, as they were compelled to leave. Nevertheless, if they had desired to return, they could have returned. Since they did not return, they evidently chose to abandon the place of idol worship and thereby revoked its status. So the Gemara seems to be wondering, well, if it was abandoned, which would be to our halachic benefit because then we could get use out of it, the question is, was it abandoned because people were like, this is not Avodah Zarah anymore, and they left? Or did they leave because they were scared and they ran away? But really, in their heart of hearts, they would love to worship again. If that was the case in the time of war, let's say they scattered and ran, then it wouldn't count enough as being an abandoned place of idol worship, and therefore it would still be a problem. But because they dispersed as God punished, they could have come back if they wanted to, and they didn't. It shows that people really do not conscientiously see this as a place of idol worship anymore. This is a very pedantic halachic discussion. Some of you from last week might remember our discussion on Masechet Ketubot was also pretty halachically pedantic. But just like last time, this pedantic discussion is actually a microcosm of this larger discussion of what was happening at Migdal Bavel, the Tower of Babel, and what was it being used as in order to cause such problems, right? Like before, we were seeing that there was idol worship happening there. But this is the first time that we're reading actually the tower itself functioned as a kind of idol worship. This is a whole new read, and that Nimrod was behind it. So I think that as much as that could be a difficult back and forth to follow, hopefully people can see that that's the microcosm discussion happening here. And I'm wondering now with some of this information, not just that idol worship happened there, but the tower itself was a kind of idol worship and that Nimrod was involved. I wonder if this creates a whole new layer of understanding and maybe appreciation for these people not going into the generation, not going into the world to come. Or maybe some people have the same problems as before. What new things have you gleaned from this reading?
Go for it, Linda. You seem like you're about to say something.
Well, God, it's still troubling me because, okay, so now there's a story, there's a narrative to help us understand this. But if people left it because they were not worshiping the idols any longer, then one would, I mean, Barry was talking about teshuva, one would assume, that, okay, if they have left that, then, there's still, we're not yet formed as a people. We're not yet formed in terms of responsibilities and understandings of things. So again, the question looms in my mind anyway, why is that closed to them? Why is the world to come closed to them? is everyone prior to, to a certain point in time when we have a covenant barred from the world to come? I mean, is that the understanding that we're sort of working on to, then, okay, then generation after generation after generation, whatever, are not going to ascend, to that place. But if it's not that, then I'm still not sure why. It's not as though Nimrod and the people who are following him are adamant, and come back and rebuild the tower and strive to do this more. I don't know. That's what you were hearing in my hesitation. I'm playing with this in my mind.
It's all good, Linda.
That's such a good point. I hadn't even thought about that, right? Like the halachic discussion about did they leave there, conscientiously, or did they run out, is kind of like maybe putting them in a whole new light, saying no, they also did willingly choose to not go back, which does look good on their character. But then also that makes that section in Sanhedrin that they don't get a portion of the world to come all the more problematic, is we do believe in a concept of tshuva, and then yet this happens. And Audrey brought this up in the chat as well. Like monotheism was hard at this time, right? There's no Abrahamic covenant. Like, do we really blame them for not fully having like the greatest theological framework to understand how the Zohar should work?
Think that through.
Yeah, I think
Well,
that's
I
a
mean,
really
I
good point.
Sorry, this
Oh,
is
yeah.
Audrey.
Yeah,
It just
hello.
seems like it's a recurring theme that people try to be monotheistic, they fail, and then in some way they're punished or like excluded from benefits. Something I was wondering though, and I'm not sure if we're allowed to go into this, do we have any background on like what was going on historically at this period? Was there some like powerful cultural force that was threatening for some reason, and that this is in parallel or is actually describing this occurrence in history?
That's a great question. I don't know for sure, but something that comes to my mind that I could provide, I guess, in Google image form is the concept of ziggurats. This is in ancient Mesopotamia, which is, I guess, where either this is happening, this is the cultural context in which they're familiar with. And I'm not like a great ziggurat expert, but from like 5th grade, I don't know, ancient civilizations class, from what I remember, is that this was a tower that was also clearly a temple, right? Like it was built with steps, and you're supposed to walk up to heaven, and then do sacrifices there. And that was the sacrificial orientation that a lot of even if the rabbis themselves in the Gemara I don't think this was not happening anymore when they were living in Babylon. They probably knew historically, because people in Babylonia where they were talking about what it was like thousands of years ago. They probably knew that this was a thing. And so I wonder if they're trying to map on their understanding of ziggurats onto what the story of Migdal Bavel is, or during whatever, like the story of Migdal Bavel itself might be reflecting some of this tension and the pros and the cons that could come from. On the one hand, it's like so amazing to try and connect to heaven and above, and maybe I do want to have that pipeline of water, right, like going between heaven and earth, but also this is not really how we connect to God in Judaism. Like it's a little too physical. So I wonder, I don't know if that fully answers your question, Audrey, but I wonder if this is looming in the background.
That's excellent. Thank you. No, I'm impressed that you so quickly pulled up a ziggurat. So thank you.
The beauty of modern technology, I guess.
I thought I was asking like an inappropriate question, and then you're like, here's all
No.
these pictures. Thank you.
No,
Quick
thank you
question.
so much for asking.
Where
Yeah.
was that in proximity geographically to the Tower of Babel?
So I'm pretty sure this is their origin story for where Babylon came from in ancient Mesopotamia, is that it's all like the Fertile Crescent. It's all that area. I don't know. It'd be great to know how Babylonians, what they think their origin story is. I don't know. I'm sure there is lots of writing about that. But I wonder if they have their own story. I mean, I think like the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, I don't know. My mom is on this call, and she's like an academic Jewish person, so she might have much more knowledge than me on the subject. There's her camera. No, she does not. Her expertise is Midrash. That is later than this time period. But I wonder, I'm sure there's real research on this about like what kind of origin stories the Babylonian people have for where they came from. Do they see themselves as coming from this valley where this tower was, and then everyone got dispersed? or is that just us? I think there's got to be research out there on that, and that sounds like a fun rabbit hole to go down to after this.
I have a personal
Oh,
comment and,
yeah.
and an observation about the spiritual aspect of what's going on here.
Sure.
We were talking about one of these great commentators in our class here about where this all came from and how this was the mindset going on here in terms of Vodazara and Audrey's comment about the cultural, nice comment, Audrey, and the cultural influences
Yeah, thank you.
possibly. And I'm thinking, you're welcome, honestly said. And I'm thinking that we have some historical reference. If you take Torah as historical reference, and that is, there's nobody to dispute it, one way or another. You don't have to believe it, but there's nobody to dispute it, that there was a people throughout and mankind, humankind, and animals alike that were doing wrong things and sinning, and so bad that God decides to flood the world. And God approaches Noach, the righteous and person of his time. And I'm one of the ones who after years of studying and learning and thinking, have swayed back and forth on the issue and finally concluded this time around that Noach was a righteous and holy person, that God should approach him, that God should save him and his family from the flood, and from that comes the new population. And he's got a couple of sons who go, one goes astray, one goes kind of astray, one stays the path, and there's background. And I'm thinking Noach set a high bar. And I think he would have been a holy and righteous person in any generation from what I'm thinking now, because this could have all been over and God could have started from scratch. And he didn't, or God didn't. So that's the underlying thing in me. And from that, we start to compare these guys. These guys had the Noach bar before them, and they chose to go around it. So that, and they had to come from the line, right? Were they Canaan's descendants? They were obviously they were one of the three sons' descendants, and I'm sure it wasn't Shem. So it had to be either Yaphet or Canaan, one way or another. But they had the bar there, and they could have gone to granddad, great granddad, however they wanted. They had an option. They should have known he was there, and they should have known about him, and they didn't. So yeah, I think that there was some imputation. God had some expectations here. The people had intellect. They had an ability to choose righteousness and right, and they didn't. Whether or not it was bad enough to bar them from the world to come, I'm still bothered with, but it was a human choice, I think. And Nimrod didn't help. And later on, we know Nimrod is the instrument of the burning of Avraham, which he survives, which he survives, and one of the tests, and God is good with that test, right? But Nimrod was a player, and so he, like anybody since him, who didn't sanctify God's name in front of the people he could persuade and he could lead, he did evil that way. And Moshe was barred from crossing the Jordan River because he failed to sanctify. Moshe Rabbeinu barred from crossing the River Jordan because he didn't sanctify God's name at Massa. And so, if that kind of thing happens, all the more for Nimrod. I can see where that happens. I still have a tough time with the generation, but Nimrod was a bad player, and he was a bad leader. And Noach's standard and bar were there to be taken.
Well, I the time is ticking. Crazy enough, it's almost 2:30 here in England.
Oh, wow.
I want to take us here
Sorry, go.
to the last source that I have here is the takeaway. I think that we're bringing up a lot of points. Like we have all this discussion on the Gemara of what was exactly the sin that was going on, how is Nimrod involved, but what exactly is so bad? And I think that Avodah Zarah is bad. I think we can all understand like worshiping someone that's other than God, not great. But what exactly is the issue? Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, he writes in Abraham's Journey, which is a book of his that's like pretty less well known than some of his other ones. Luckily, I have friends who have read it and they were telling me about it. And I went, oh, that's great for this year. He writes a lot about the dangers of being in a culture in which we worship technology. And he's writing this also at the beginning of the space race. And I think that's like a really interesting layer, is he's probably thinking about the Cold War, and he's thinking about how technology can come to beautify, but also to be very dangerous. And I think that there's a clear connection here, and I'm hoping that's what we're going to leave off with. This is the source. This pagan gives reference to doctrine over living souls, to the figment of some utopian idea over human reality. This society is ruled by power-hungry men who want to possess and own the individual, or rather to deprive the individual of his soul, to depersonalize him and convert him into a machine, into an object. It is out to organize and convert mankind into an army and introduce uniformity. It does not believe that each individual has his own approach to life and his own unique talents. It teaches people how to write, how to paint, how to engage in sculpture, how to think scientifically. It believes in the primacy of machine over man, the primacy of dead matter over the living soul. This approach is represented by the generation of the dispersion, who defied the Almighty and sought to build a tower with its top in the heavens. They rejected the transcendental form and substituted their own law for the transcendental law. The builders of the Tower of Babel depersonalized man so thoroughly that they would ignore a man who fell off the building, but would cry when a stone or brick fell.
Wow.
So this source, I mean, you can hear
powerful.
the attack on communism that's happening in his speech. It's clear his context, where he's coming from. But I think also he's picking up on what exactly the problem with the tower is, and how could it constitute idol worship? Was it that they were just bowing to the tower? Was it the ziggurat? But it's really that and this is, I think, what the Midrash Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer that he quotes is picking up, is the worshiping of the tower meant that they were prioritizing the tower over humanity. And that is what is totally unforgivable, enough that people cannot go to the world to come through this experience. And I think that obviously Rav Soloveitchik is taking like a more drasha sermon kind of route with this, and this is not in the text, right? Like we're trouble with that before, but I think that for me, not that it makes it okay to not believe in the power of tshuva, but it helps show how skewed the values could be when we treat the tower as a kind of idol worship, and we see that that's what's happening there. And I think that a lot of our sources already point us to that direction in the Gemara. And I think that for me, it does calm me a little bit after reading the sources in the Tanakh and saying, how did the story get so bad? But to say that this is actually what's going on. And I think also this message, I mean, technology has only gotten more crazy since the Cold War. It's beautiful. We're speaking on Zoom right now, and that's a miracle in and of itself. But there are a lot of other cons that come with the rise in technology. And I think that for us, bowing down to idols seems like a foreign concept in our 21st century mindset. But being slaves to technology enough that we might kind of forget the humanity in front of us is definitely an issue that is still rampant today. So I hope through these Talmudic sources, Rav Soloveitchik's framing, we can have a whole new takeaway of this story, not just like a cute kid's story that we heard in day school, but kind of seeing this fight with the heavens and with each other as really being a discussion about what are we worshiping and what is taking priority in our lives so much so that we're losing the humanity that is in front of us. And I hope that framing can be something new that you take away from this story. And it was so lovely learning it with all of you this evening. So thank you so much.
I have a
Thank
quick
you.
question for you. Before you run,
Sure.
can you entertain a question? I
Yes.
was hoping you would leave that up there. Rav
Happy to put
Soloveitchik's,
it back.
that's okay. Rav
Okay.
Soloveitchik's comment included a phrase and a cite to Breshit about defying God's I don't know, define God, define God implies that there was maybe something said or something to be derived. And I was not sure what that was. That wasn't clear from the text of the Torah, and it hasn't been clear from anything that we discussed now, because, I mean, for me, it wasn't defined because of the lack of further source, which is just a product of my evolving as a student and as a learner. So what was that, what was being defied that they should have known was being defied? It implies an accountability. This was demonstrated by the generation of the dispersion, that they defied God and etc. And then there was something in parenthesis that I couldn't read completely, that it was a site to Bereshit. And I'm thinking, what did they defy? I know they built the tower, but what was defying about that? I didn't see that in the words. I didn't deduce it. I haven't read it in Raji's commentary. I haven't seen it here tonight. What was defied? Unless we go back and see the Avodah Zarah issue was defying God, but yet I don't know. I'm wondering what defied God.
I think that the defying of God was building a tower that, in a way, that prioritized that over worshiping God, or seeing that as the source of truth and the way that one determines values. And it's true that, that Ma'amad Har Sinai and the Abrahamic covenant did not exist yet, but there is an understanding that there is like a universal, both, I would say, like, sense of humanity. I'd like to hope that that's innate in all of us, but also there is a real understanding of the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, of the Noahide laws. And those were already given at that time. Right? We could do like a whole different share about, how did they get that from the sources in the Tanakh? It's like not so clear, but the value in humankind and like not murdering, for example, is like clearly in the Noahide commandments. So one would hope that the appreciation for humanity would make sure to not be skewed. And
So
it
the
seems
Noah's
like
Ark.
the suggestion is that the tower skewed that sense of humanity.
Well, certainly Nimrod had an agenda, and he persuaded people to follow him. That was also one of Rashi's commentaries that I read, that Nimrod was a persuader of people. And
Yeah, he was a
part of
hunter,
his
just
nature
like
was
Esav.
he was a hunter, but he was a
Yeah.
persuader of people. He lured
Right.
people with his words, not just with his arrows.
Yeah. So I think that definitely adds to his character here, that he was kind of rallying everyone up. There was also in that passage from Rav Soloveitchik, like the danger of turning everyone to an army, right? We were saying like, oh, everyone gathering in war. Like, I mean, it's not good, but like, it's not such a capital offense, like enough that you think that maybe that you'd have to not go to world to come. But it does seem that that's part of Soloveitchik's thinking as well, which is interesting.
I mean,
Amazing. Okay, thank you
Yeah.
so much, everyone. Thank you for coming. I hope that this was
everybody.
Thank
Great job.
you.
Thank
you,
This is a great class, Sophie. Sylvia.
amazing. Thank you. All
Thank
right,
you.
see you all next week.
God willing, yeah.
Sounds
thank you.
good.
Amazing.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care.